I was standing in the hallway with my coat still folded over my arm when I heard it from the kitchen. Not whispered. Not slipped out by mistake. Why do we even need a poor woman here? The words landed cleanly, like a plate set down too hard. I froze, keys pressing into my palm, the metal cold and familiar. The smell of coffee drifted past me, calm and ordinary, as if nothing cruel had just been said. On the kitchen table lay an open folder. My folder. A tax document I had brought by habit, not intention. Annual income, $40,000. Mine. Real. Earned. Every dollar accounted for. My son stood there, staring at the floor tiles as if they might open up and save him. He didn't know about my income. He had never asked. And now, when it mattered, he said nothing at all. No correction. No defense. Not even my name. Something inside me went quiet. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a clean break, like a thread pulled too tight. I slipped my coat on slowly, the lining brushing my wrists. No one followed me. No one called out. The door closed behind me with a soft, final click. I walked into the cold evening alone, my question heavy and unanswered. How could they do this to me? If you want to hear my full story, please subscribe to the channel. And tell me in the comments what city you're listening from. I want to know how far this story travels. My name is Linda. I was not raised to speak loudly about myself, so even writing that feels like setting a glass down where it might tip. But if I'm going to tell this properly, you need to know who I was long before that kitchen sentence tried to shrink me. For 38 years, I worked as a financial controller. I sat under fluorescent lights, listening to printers hum and phones ring, balancing other people's budgets with steady hands. I learned how to find the missing dollar, how to read between the lines of a statement, how to notice what didn't belong. Numbers never frightened me. What frightened me was people, and what they could convince themselves they deserved. I married young, as women in my neighborhood did. My husband was kind, but life is not always. He died early, too early to feel fair, leaving me with a mortgage, a small boy, and the strange silence that fills a house when grief becomes routine. I didn't fall apart. I didn't have the luxury. I got up. I packed lunches. I ironed shirts. I showed up at work with my hair pinned back and my eyes dry. My son grew up watching me do that. He grew up believing strength looked like quiet competence. I thought that was a good lesson. I still do, in some ways. But there is a difference between being steady and being ignored, and I didn't see when that line began to blur. When he married Melissa, I told myself I would be careful not to intrude. She was polished in a way I never learned to be, perfect nails, perfect hair, the right purse at the right angle on her arm. She spoke about restaurants I couldn't pronounce and vacations planned around experiences, like ordinary places weren't worth their time. She wasn't openly cruel at first. Not exactly. She was simply certain. Certain that her way was the correct way. Certain that my way was outdated. Certain that I should be grateful to be included at all. They lived in a newer home across town, the kind with bright counters and nothing on the walls that could be called sentimental. When I visited, I brought what I always brought, something warm to eat, something useful, something chosen with care. A pot of soup. A set of towels. A little envelope for my grandson's school trip. I never arrived empty-handed, because I knew what it meant to stretch a week's groceries into 8 days. At first, my son thanked me. He always did. He hugged me with one arm while scrolling his phone with the other. I noticed that, too, how he held me like a task while his attention stayed elsewhere. Still, I told myself not to be sensitive. People are busy. Young families are busy. I was not entitled to their time. But slowly, I began to feel like a piece of furniture in their life. Convenient. Familiar. Easy to move into a corner. Melissa would laugh at small things. My sensible shoes. The way I saved wrapping paper. The fact that I still used coupons. "You live like someone who never had money," she said once, smiling as if it were a compliment. I remember the exact moment because we were standing by the sink, and the window above it had a little smudge in the corner. I had the dish towel in my hand. The water ran. My son was leaning against the counter behind her, watching something on the television. I waited. I waited for him to say, "That's my mother." I waited for him to add, "She raised me alone." I waited for anything that sounded like recognition. He only shrugged, as if my life were a minor preference, like choosing tea over coffee. It was a small thing. That is what I told myself. Small, and therefore forgivable. Small, and therefore not worth making a scene about. But that shrug stayed with me. It followed me home, sat beside me in the quiet of my kitchen, where my own counters were worn and my own walls held photographs. I stood there that night, holding my favorite mug, the one with the faded blue flowers, and I realized something unsettling. Silence can be a habit. And habits become patterns before you have the sense to name them. I did not know then how often my son would choose it. I only knew that something had shifted, almost invisibly. And once it shifts, it rarely shifts back on its own. After that, Melissa's comments arrived like little pins. Not enough to draw blood but enough to make me aware of where my skin was thin. If I brought groceries, she'd say, "We have a delivery service for that." If I offered to watch my grandson, she'd say, "He's used to our routine." If I mentioned a bill or a repair, she'd tilt her head and say, "Oh, don't worry. We handle it differently." And my son, my once tender boy, would stand nearby, eyes sliding away at the exact moment he should have met mine. He wasn't unkind. He was absent, and that hurt more, because it left me no clear enemy to blame. I began to edit myself before I spoke. I began to wonder whether love had become something you had to afford. And still I kept showing up, because I believed consistency meant something. That was my mistake. After that, the pattern settled in quietly, the way dust does when no one is looking. My gifts became unnecessary. That was the word Melissa liked. She said it lightly, waving a hand as if brushing crumbs from a table. "You really don't have to do this," she'd say, setting aside the sweater I'd bought on sale, or the small envelope with cash tucked inside. "We already have everything we need. Everything, except me." My advice became outdated. I would mention refinancing at a lower rate, or suggest putting a little aside for emergencies. Things I had learned the hard way. Melissa would smile that same polite smile and say, "That's not how people do it anymore." My son would nod, not because he knew, but because agreeing was easier than thinking. Even my clothes became a problem. One afternoon before guests arrived, Melissa looked me up and down and said, "Maybe wear something simpler next time. It's a bit awkward for people." I was wearing the same navy cardigan I'd worn for years, the one that still smelled faintly of lavender from my drawer. I went to the bathroom and folded it over my arm, suddenly aware of how old it made me look. Each comment alone was small. Together, they formed a language I was beginning to understand. "We live on a different level," Melissa said once, pouring wine into glasses she never offered me. The words were smooth, practiced. She said them as if stating a fact, not drawing a line. My son stood beside her, scrolling through his phone. He didn't look up. He didn't disagree. I started to feel like a guest who had overstayed without noticing the clock. I arrived earlier. I left sooner. I cleaned up after myself twice. I learned where to stand so I wouldn't be in the way. I learned how to smile without showing too much of what I felt. At night, back in my own home, I replayed conversations while the refrigerator hummed and the clock ticked too loudly. I told myself I was imagining things. That I was being sensitive. That this was the cost of getting older, becoming less relevant in rooms you once anchored. But sadness has weight. It sits on your chest in quiet moments. It makes your hands slower. I noticed it when I folded laundry, when I counted out change at the grocery store, when I reached for the phone and then set it back down. The kitchen moment, the one with the words I couldn't unhear, did not come from nowhere. It was the end of a long sentence they had been writing for years. That night, when I walked out with my coat still on, I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit before. Silence is not neutral. It is a choice, repeated over time until it becomes character. When I replay that evening now, I see it clearly. The open tax document on the table. The numbers neat and undeniable. The irony of it all sitting there between us. They thought they knew exactly who I was. They were wrong, but not in the way that mattered most. I wasn't hurt because they thought I was poor. I was hurt because they thought that made me disposable. In that kitchen, with the overhead light too bright and the coffee gone cold, I looked at my son and waited one last time. Not for a speech. Not for an apology. Just for recognition. He knew everything I had done for him. He knew the years I stayed awake balancing accounts, the jobs I turned down so I could be home when he needed me, the way I never asked him for anything in return. And still, he chose silence. It felt like a scream trapped behind glass. No sound. Just pressure. I left because staying would have meant agreeing. Agreeing that this was what I was worth. Agreeing that love was conditional, and dignity negotiable. As I walked down the steps and into the night, the cold air burned my lungs. My hand shook, but not from fear. From clarity arriving all at once. That was the moment everything changed, even if none of them knew it yet. That night, I did not turn on the lights when I got home. I hung my coat on the same hook it had always used and stood in the dark hallway, listening to the house settle. The familiar creak near the bedroom. The faint buzz of the refrigerator. Everything still belonged to me here. No one questioned why. I sat at the small kitchen table and opened my bag. The folder was still inside. I hadn't planned to take it, but my hands had moved on their own. The tax document lay flat under my palms, the paper cool and firm. Numbers have always calmed me. They tell the truth without emotion. $40,000 a year. Every year. Clean. Legal. Mine. I had never hidden it out of shame. I hid it out of choice. I didn't want my place in my son's life to depend on what I could provide. I wanted to be welcome because I was his mother, not because I could cover a bill or smooth over a rough month. I traced the edge of the page with my finger and thought back to the small decisions I had made over time. The checks I wrote quietly. The groceries I paid for without mention. The school fees that just happened to be covered. I had never announced these things. I believed dignity lived in discretion. Sitting there, I realized something unsettling. They had grown used to my support without ever seeing me. My son didn't know my income because he had never asked who I was beyond what he needed. Melissa assumed I had little because it suited her story. And I had allowed it, because correcting her felt like begging for relevance. The truth settled in slowly, like dust after movement stops. Without money, or the appearance of it, I held no weight in their world. Not my history. Not my effort. Not my restraint. I didn't cry. I've cried enough in my life to recognize when tears won't help. Instead, I opened my bank app and looked through it calmly. The balances. The automatic transfers. The recurring payments I had set up years ago without fanfare. Gym membership for Melissa. Streaming services billed to my card. A portion of their mortgage payment labeled temporary, 3 years old. Temporary has a way of becoming permanent when no one questions it. I made a cup of tea and let it go cold beside me while I read. Each line told a story I had refused to read before. Not of theft, exactly, but of expectation. Of entitlement built on my silence. That was when the thought arrived, fully formed and unshakable. This ends now. Not in anger. Not in revenge. Just in truth. I didn't sleep much that night. I wasn't restless. I was alert. There is a difference. I wrote down what I needed to do on a yellow notepad, the pen moving steadily. Cancel payments. Change passwords. Separate accounts. No explanations yet. Just structure. In the morning, sunlight came through the kitchen window and landed on the same mug with the faded blue flowers. I wrapped my hands around it and felt something unfamiliar, steadiness without obligation. For the first time, my choices would not be shaped by how they might react. I didn't call my son. I didn't send a message. I went about my day as I always had, only lighter. At the bank, the clerk smiled politely. At the grocery store, I took my time reading labels. The world did not collapse because I stopped holding it up for others. By the end of the week, the changes were complete. Quiet. Procedural. Ethical. Just the way I liked things. I knew consequences would follow. They always do. But consequences are not cruelty. They are simply the result of truth meeting reality. And I was finally ready to let that happen. 2 weeks after I closed those quiet channels of support, my phone began to behave differently. It rang. Not the casual Sunday call where my son asked a quick question and ended the conversation with busy, Mom. This time it rang again after I let it go to voicemail. Then again. Then a text appeared, short and uncharacteristically sharp. Did the mortgage payment not go through? I stared at the screen until it dimmed. Outside my kitchen window, a sparrow hopped along the sill, pecking at nothing. The ordinary world kept moving, even when someone else's comfort cracked. I didn't answer right away. I made my oatmeal. I washed my bowl. I waited until my hands were steady, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted my next choices to be clean. By afternoon, Melissa called. She never called me directly unless she needed something. Her voice came through bright and controlled. Linda, hi. We're having a little issue with some accounts. Your card was on file for a few things and it looks like it stopped. Stopped, as if it had died on its own. I said, yes. A pause. So you can fix it? I could hear my grandson in the background, a cartoon chirping. Domestic noise. A life cushioned by invisible help. No, I said. I won't. Her breath caught. Excuse me? I removed my payment information, I told her. I'm not paying for services I don't use. She tried a laugh that didn't land. Okay, but the mortgage. That was never my responsibility, I said, still calm. It was something I chose. I'm choosing differently now. The line went quiet. In that silence, I felt the old habit tugging at me, to soften it, to explain, to make it easier for them to hear. I didn't. Later that night, my son finally called. His voice sounded tired in a way I recognized from his childhood, when he had a problem and didn't know how to fix it. Mom, what's going on? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't remind him of years and sacrifices. I asked one question. Do you remember what was said in your kitchen? Another pause. Longer this time. Melissa didn't mean it like that, he said quietly. And you? I asked. What did you mean by saying nothing? He exhaled, slow. I didn't know what to say. That was the truth, and it was also the problem. I'm not asking you to fight, I told him. I'm asking you to see me. If you can't do that, then you don't get to use me. He started to speak, but the words came out tangled. We've just been stressed. Things are expensive. You've always helped, so we thought. You thought it would continue, I finished. Without respect. He said my name then, soft, like a plea. Mom, I'm sorry. I believed he felt something. But regret is not the same as change, and I had learned to tell the difference. The next day, a message arrived from Melissa. Longer. Carefully written. She apologized for how it sounded. She suggested dinner. She offered to start fresh. At the end, she wrote, "Family is everything." I read it twice. Then I set my phone down and looked around my living room. The crocheted throw on my chair. The framed photo of my husband on the mantel. The candle I lit in winter that still smelled faintly of vanilla. This was family, too. The people who had loved me without conditions, even if they were gone now. I replied with one sentence. I'm taking space, and I'm not discussing this further. No argument. No explanation. For a few days, they tried other doors. My sister called, hesitant. They say there was a misunderstanding. I heard what I heard, I said. And I saw what I saw. Then the consequences began to show themselves in small public ways. A cancelled flight they couldn't rebook without fees. A late notice they didn't expect. A friend's birthday dinner they skipped because money is tight right now, words Melissa had never used before. I didn't celebrate any of it. I simply watched the truth do its work. And slowly, my own life widened. I joined a community center book group on Tuesdays. I volunteered to organize their budget, not because I had to, but because I wanted to be useful where I was valued. I started walking in the mornings, scarf tucked under my chin, breathing cold air that belonged only to me. One Saturday, I bought myself a new coat. Not expensive. Just well made, in a color that suited my face. At home, I hung it on the hook and felt something settle inside me like a door finally closing. I wasn't poor. Not because my income was secret or my savings were tidy, but because I had stopped giving my dignity away in exchange for a seat at someone else's table. Sometimes I missed my grandson's laugh, and I grieved what could have been. But grief is not a contract. I could love them and still step back. That was my peace. At last. If this touched a nerve, you belong here. Subscribe to hear truths where silence becomes strength. And wherever you're listening from, know this: leaving quietly can be the loudest way to choose yourself. For a while after that, there was nothing. No calls. No messages. No accidental likes on old photos. Just absence, clean and uninterrupted. I learned how loud quiet can be when it no longer carries expectation. My days found a new shape. I woke without the small knot of anticipation that used to live in my chest. I brewed coffee and drank it slowly, standing by the window. The street filled with ordinary life. A delivery truck. A woman walking a dog. A man jogging past with his breath fogging the air. No one needed anything from me, and that felt like freedom. Weeks passed. Then months. When my son finally came to my door, he didn't call first. He stood on the step with his hands in his coat pockets, shoulders slightly folded inward. He looked older. Not wiser. Just worn by consequences he hadn't planned for. I won't come in, he said. I just wanted to talk. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. The porch light hummed softly above us. I miss you, he said. His voice cracked, but I stayed still. Missing someone is not the same as respecting them. I know, I answered. He waited for more. I gave him silence, the kind he had practiced so well. Finally, he said, things are different now. I believed that. Different doesn't always mean better. I understand, I said. But I'm not going back to how it was. He nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer and hoped it wouldn't arrive. Melissa says she was wrong. She said words, I replied. I needed actions. He looked down at the step, then back at me. I should have spoken up. Yes, I said. Not cruel. Just true. We stood there a moment longer. Then he left, and I went back inside and lit a candle. The flame steadied itself, small but certain. Life didn't become perfect after that. It became honest. I spent holidays quietly or with people who saw me clearly. I traveled once, alone, to a coastal town where no one knew my history. I walked the shore in a borrowed scarf and let the wind decide my thoughts. I kept my routines. My mug. My chair. My keys placed just so. These were not signs of loneliness. They were evidence of a life I inhabited fully. Sometimes I thought about that kitchen. The sentence that changed everything. I no longer felt its sting. Only its clarity. My son didn't know about my income. His wife called me poor. My son stayed silent. I left. And in leaving, I stayed with myself. That was enough. I used to think endings were loud. That they arrived with raised voices, slammed doors, final speeches that made everything clear. I know better now. The real ending had already happened long before my son stood on my porch, before the candle flame steadied in my living room. It happened the first morning I woke up and realized no one was waiting to see what I would give. I sat at my kitchen table, sunlight falling across the worn surface, and felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not joy. Not sadness. Space. The kind that lets you breathe all the way down. I didn't tell many people what happened. When neighbors asked about my son, I said he was busy. When my sister hinted that I might reconsider, I told her I was well. I wasn't interested in being understood by everyone. I was interested in staying whole. There were moments I doubted myself. In the grocery store, when I passed the cereal my grandson liked. On Sundays, when the afternoon stretched too quietly. Doubt is not a sign of weakness. It is the echo of old training, reminding you to put yourself last. I learned to let it pass. I spent time with my memories, not to punish myself, but to set them in order. I remembered the nights I sat at the dining table with bills spread out, my son asleep down the hall. The careful choices. The discipline. The way I never once called myself a victim. I was a woman doing what needed to be done. That woman deserved respect then. She deserved it now. I didn't become smaller with age. I became clearer. I understood that love without regard erodes you slowly. That being useful is not the same as being valued. That silence, when it protects cruelty, is not kindness at all. The world did not end because I stepped back. It adjusted. As it always does. Sometimes I imagine my son at his own kitchen table now, numbers open in front of him, understanding for the first time what steadiness costs. I hope he learns. I hope he speaks sooner next time. That hope does not require my return. What I know is this: dignity does not announce itself. It shows up in small, firm decisions made when no one is watching. It lives in leaving when staying would mean agreeing to be diminished. I was called poor. But poverty was never about my bank account. It was about how little of myself I was allowed to keep when I stayed silent for others' comfort. Now, my life is modest and sufficient. My days are my own. My worth is no longer negotiated in other people's kitchens. If you are listening to this and recognize the quiet erasing, the polite disregard, the way your generosity has become expected instead of honored, know that you are not imagining it. Sometimes the strongest choice is to leave quietly and live with dignity. If this story touched a nerve, you belong here. Subscribe to hear truths where silence becomes strength. Wherever you are listening from, remember this: choosing yourself is not abandonment. It is survival, done with grace. In the months that followed, I learned something no one had ever taught me. Peace is not empty. It is simply uncluttered. I began to rearrange my days the way I once rearranged ledgers, slowly, deliberately, removing what did not belong. I stopped bracing myself before conversations that never came. I stopped rehearsing explanations for choices I no longer needed to defend. The world grew quieter, and in that quiet my thoughts returned to me, one by one, like birds finding a familiar roof. I kept one photograph on the table beside my chair. My son is a boy, front tooth missing, holding a crooked paper crown he had made at school. I did not look at it with bitterness. I looked at it with truth. Love can exist without proximity. Memory does not demand self-erasure. There were mornings I woke with an old reflex, the urge to check my phone, to see who might need something from me. When there was nothing, I felt the echo of a life built around usefulness. I learned to sit with that feeling instead of filling it. It passed every time. Sometimes people believe boundaries are punishment. They are not. They are measurements. They tell others how to approach you, and they tell you where you end and someone else begins. I had spent years blurred at the edges, available beyond reason. Now my outline was clear, and clarity felt like rest. I paid my bills on time and without anxiety. I planned small trips months ahead, choosing seats by the window. I cooked for myself and set the table properly, even when no one else was there. These were not lonely acts. They were acknowledgments of presence. No one ever apologized the way stories promise. There was no sudden awakening, no speech that rewrote the past. Real life rarely offers that. What it offered me instead was steadiness without cost, consistency without obligation. I was no longer weighed, assessed, or quietly ranked. When I walked through my home at night, slippers soft against the floor, I felt rooted. I had not escaped anything dramatic. I had simply stepped out of a role that required me to disappear so others could feel comfortable. If I could speak to the woman I was in that hallway, coat in her hands, I would not tell her to be patient. I would tell her this: you are allowed to leave rooms that refuse to see you. Dignity does not beg for a chair. It stands up and chooses where to sit. And that choice, once made, carries you the rest of the way. I learned to trust the quiet decisions. The ones no one applauds. The ones that look small from the outside but change the weight of a life. I stopped measuring my days by how helpful I had been and started noticing how present I felt inside them. That shift alone altered everything. There were afternoons I spent reading at the library, my coat folded beside me, sunlight moving across the table inch by inch. No one interrupted. No one expected me to solve anything. I remembered how much I liked being a person instead of a function. I also learned that forgiveness does not always arrive wearing reconciliation. Sometimes it arrives as release. I did not carry anger with me. I carried knowledge. Knowledge is lighter, and it leaves your hands free. I chose carefully who I allowed close. I paid attention to how people spoke when they did not need anything. I noticed who listened without waiting for their turn. These observations became my new wealth. On my birthday that year, I bought myself flowers. I placed them in a clear vase and watched them open over several days. I did not rush them. I had rushed enough things in my life already. There are still moments when the past tries to speak loudly. When it does, I answer with evidence. I look around my home. I look at my calendar. I look at the steadiness of my breathing. And I remember that choosing myself was not a single act, but a practice. Leaving did not make me hard. It made me honest. And honesty, I have learned, is a form of kindness we owe ourselves. This is what I know now, and what I would leave behind for anyone listening quietly: you do not need permission to step into your own life. You do not need agreement to protect your peace. If staying costs you your voice, the price is too high. Walk away with your head level, your hands steady, and your dignity intact. That is not failure. That is arrival. I did not lose my family when I left that kitchen. I lost an illusion. What remained was smaller, quieter, and far more real. I wake each day knowing where I stand, and I no longer shrink to make space for people who would not stand beside me. That certainty is my inheritance now, and I guard it carefully. I am still Linda. Still careful. Still capable. But now, I belong to myself first. And that, at last, feels like home. I keep moving forward, not loudly, not bitterly, but with a steady kind of grace that does not need witnesses. That is enough. Truly. I am done proving my worth. I live it. Every day. Quietly. With care. Always. And I did not announce my decision to anyone, because some choices grow better in silence. Time continued the way it always does, indifferent and steady. Seasons changed without asking my permission. Leaves gathered along the curb, then disappeared. Snow came once, thin and hesitant, and melted by afternoon. I watched it all from my window, cup warm in my hands, feeling no urgency to be anywhere else. People think rebuilding means adding things. For me, it meant subtraction. I removed myself from arguments that were never meant to be solved. I stopped carrying other people's discomfort as if it were my responsibility. I let unanswered questions remain unanswered. They did not poison the air the way I once feared they would. I noticed how my body responded. My shoulders lowered. My sleep deepened. I no longer woke with my jaw clenched, replaying conversations that had already taken their toll. Even my reflection looked different, softer somehow, as if my face had been waiting for permission to rest. There were still difficult days. Healing is not a straight line, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. Some mornings I felt the ache of distance, especially when I passed families laughing together in public places. I allowed myself that ache. I did not turn it into a verdict against my choice. What surprised me most was how capable I still felt. Independence had not aged out of me. I handled my affairs. I learned new routes through the city. I asked for help when I needed it and offered it only when it was welcome. Mutuality became my standard. I thought often about the word poor. How easily it had been used. How casually it had dismissed a lifetime of care, restraint, and endurance. I understood then that poverty of spirit is far more damaging than lack of money. And that is what I refused to inherit. I began writing things down, not for anyone else, just for myself. Observations. Memories. Small victories no one else would notice. I wrote about the first evening I laughed out loud at a book. The first morning I realized I was looking forward to the day. These were not dramatic milestones, but they were mine. I did not close the door forever. I simply locked it until respect learned how to knock. That distinction mattered to me. It kept my heart intact without leaving it unguarded. If there is a lesson in any of this, it is not about leaving or staying. It is about listening. About paying attention when your inner voice grows quiet instead of loud. That quiet is often clarity asking to be trusted. I trusted it. And that trust carried me forward, one ordinary day at a time, into a life that fit me again. There was one afternoon, months later, when I understood how fully things had changed. I was standing in a small stationery shop, the kind that still smells of paper and ink, choosing a notebook. Not because I needed one, but because I wanted it. That distinction mattered. I ran my fingers along the spines, feeling the textures, letting myself take time. No one was waiting. No one would be inconvenienced by my choice. I bought a simple one, cream-colored, and carried it home like something fragile. That evening, I sat at my table and opened it. The first page stayed blank for a long time. I listened to the tick of the clock and the distant sound of traffic. Then I wrote my name at the top, slowly, carefully. Not as an introduction. As a claim. I began using that notebook to mark my days. Not appointments or obligations, but moments. The sound of rain against the window. A neighbor waving as I passed. The feeling of finishing a task and realizing I still had energy left. These were small things, but together they formed a life that felt intentional. I no longer waited for invitations that came with conditions. When I wanted company, I chose it. When I wanted solitude, I honored it. I learned that loneliness and aloneness are not the same thing. One drains you. The other restores. Occasionally, news reached me through others. They were adjusting. They were learning. Or so I was told. I listened without comment. My peace no longer depended on updates from a place I had already left. I thought again about my son, not with anger, but with clarity. He was not cruel by nature. He was comfortable with silence because silence had protected him. That understanding did not erase the hurt, but it explained it. Explanations help you set things down. As the year turned, I felt something close to gratitude. Not for what had happened, but for what it had revealed. I knew now that respect cannot be negotiated after the fact. It must be present from the beginning, or it will never arrive. I did not rebuild bridges. I built ground. Solid, dependable, my own. And standing on it, I felt steady enough to face whatever came next. One Friday in early March, my phone lit up with a message I did not recognize at first. It was from my son, but it did not sound like him. "Mom, can we talk tonight? Please. It's important." I read it twice, then set the phone face down on the table beside my notebook. The cream cover was already soft at the corners from use. I had begun to trust the act of writing things down. It made truth harder to edit later. I did not answer immediately. I finished what I was doing, washing the breakfast dishes, wiping the counter, folding the dish towel the way I always had. That simple order steadied me. When I finally picked up the phone again, I typed one line. "You can call at 7. At 6:58, the kettle clicked off. At 6:59, I carried my mug, blue flowers faded, handle warm, into the living room. At exactly 7, the phone rang. His voice arrived careful, like he was walking on a floor he did not trust. "Hi, Mom." "Hello," I said. A small pause. I could hear the hollow sound of a big room behind him. Their house always sounded like that on speaker, too much space, not enough softness. "We're having some trouble," he said. I waited. He cleared his throat. "Melissa's car needs repairs. And the daycare raised their rates. We're trying to juggle it, but you want me to fix it," I said quietly. He exhaled. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to," I replied. "You called." Another pause. I imagined his eyes dropping to the floor again, the same floor that had held his silence in that kitchen. "Mom, I am sorry," he said, and the words sounded practiced, as if someone had coached him on the way over. "We were wrong. Melissa was wrong. I should have defended you." I let the apology sit where it belonged, between us. "What are you asking for?" I said. His voice tightened. "I'm asking you to help us through this month. Just this month." I stared at the small flame of the candle on my side table. It flickered once, then steadied. "No," I said. A sharp inhale. "So you're just done with us?" I did not rise to the bait. "I am done being used," I answered. "Those are not the same." He tried another angle, softer. "Evan misses you." My grandson's name in his mouth landed like a hand reaching through a fence. My chest tightened, but I kept my voice level. "I miss him too," I said. "That doesn't change my boundary." "Then what do you want?" he asked, and for the first time I heard frustration, not need. I glanced at my notebook, open on my lap. I had written a list there weeks ago, not demands, just conditions for closeness. Respect. Direct communication. No insults disguised as jokes. No financial expectations. "I want a relationship that isn't transactional," I said. "I want to be spoken to with basic decency in your home. I want you to correct cruelty when you hear it. And I want time with Evan that isn't offered as leverage." He went quiet. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller. "Melissa won't like that." "I am not negotiating with Melissa," I told him. "I'm speaking to my son." There was a long silence, the kind that used to make me rush to fill it. I did not. I let it be his, to sit with. Finally he said, "Can you at least come to Evan's school thing next week?" That was different. No money. No request wrapped in guilt. Just a moment. "Yes," I said. "If I'm invited as his grandmother, not as a wallet." "I'll make sure," he said quickly, as if afraid I would change my mind. After we hung up, my hands trembled a little. Not from fear. From emotion arriving late, as it often does when you have been practical for too long. I wrote the date in my notebook. I wrote what was asked, and what I answered. Then I wrote one more line, for myself. Love, with boundaries, is still love. I went to the window and looked out at the streetlights turning on, one by one. The world did not reward me for my firmness. It did not punish me either. It simply continued. And for the first time I felt ready for whatever came next, because I had proof, written in my own hand, that I could hold my ground without becoming hard. The next Thursday I went to Evan's school recital. The hallway smelled of crayons and floor wax, and my coat lay across my knees as I waited. When he saw me, he ran into my arms, backpack thumping my hip. "Grandma," he whispered, as if I might vanish. Melissa arrived late, smiling brightly. She opened her mouth, the old script ready. But my son stepped closer and said, "Mom's here for Evan. Let's keep it kind." One sentence, nothing dramatic, yet it changed the air. Evan sang with the other children. I clapped until my palms warmed. Afterward he pressed a folded drawing into my hand, 3 stick figures and a sun, and held my fingers. In the parking lot my son said, "Thank you for coming." "I came for him," I told him. "If you want me close, choose your voice every time." He nodded. Melissa looked away. I drove home with the drawing on the passenger seat, feeling very solid, and unbought. After that evening, I moved carefully, the way you do when ice has cracked once and you remember the sound. I did not rush toward forgiveness. I did not retreat into bitterness either. I stayed where I was, steady, watching what happened next. That felt new to me, waiting without leaning forward. My son called once more that month. Not to ask for money. Not to smooth anything over. He asked how I was sleeping. I told him the truth. Better. Deeper. He was quiet, as if noting that answer somewhere private. Melissa kept her distance. When we crossed paths, her politeness was stiff, rehearsed. I accepted it without comment. Respect does not need warmth to be real. It only needs restraint. I learned to measure progress not by words, but by absence of harm. No jokes at my expense. No casual assumptions. No silence when something unkind hovered in the air. These changes were small, but they mattered more than apologies ever had. At home, my life continued to widen in quiet ways. I planted herbs on the windowsill. I fixed the loose hinge on the bathroom door myself. Each solved detail reminded me I was capable, still. One afternoon, I realized I no longer replayed that kitchen sentence every day. Its echo had faded. Not because it had been erased, but because it no longer defined the room I stood in. That, I understood, was healing.